Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm going to present some work regarding social inequalities in child development with a lens on language development and some interventions that we evaluated for the past few years. And so, yes, I work at the Paris School of Economics and the JPAL laboratory. Voilà. So, oh no, okay. No. L'écran. Okay. So, I think these are basic stuff, but we all know that early childhood is a critical period for development, and we know from several studies that at that age, so for the first 5 years of life, we know that the brain grows really faster than ever, is highly responsible to environmental influences. And there is this famous sentence, I don't know if it was first by James Heckman or not, but the fact that skills begets skills, right? That during the first years, children, so they grow cognitive, social-emotional skills, motor skills, that will pave the ground for the construction of future skills. And so we know from different studies that it is really important for the children to learn some basic skills so that they can learn new skills in the future. So it is really important here to have these skills beget skills in mind, because investments in early childhood are really complementaries with each other. And here today I want to talk especially about language acquisition. Language is something really important. We know that early language acquisition predicts future language skills of the children, but also other academic skills. We know, for example, that early language acquisition is really correlated with reading, writing, and overall with the schooling and later professional trajectories. So, once again, a bit obvious, but child development is shaped by interactions that they have with their environment. And when we talk about early childhood development, of course, we refer to parents, right? They play a fundamental role in the development of their children, which is obvious. And obviously, as the two presentations that just related, there are really important gaps in terms of development, and especially in terms of language development, when it comes to socioeconomic characteristics. So we have this seminal study that you, I think, all know about from Art and Risley from the 90s, where they put some recorders on babies' clothes, and they recorded everything that happened for a short period of time, where parents were talking to their babies or talking together. And from this study, we know that at 4 years old, there is a gap of 30 million words that exists between children from low socioeconomic background and children from high socioeconomic background, which is a lot really early in life, right? And they show that this is something that is increasing over time. So it is a similar study from the 90s, but it also exists elsewhere in the world, right? In France, for example, we have this study with the ELF cohort that shows, for example, that while motor skills or motor development doesn't seem to have a socioeconomic gradient, there is a significant gradient in terms of language development in France. And you see here in this graph that language development of children born from poor families is way lower than the one of the richer families. It exists in developed countries. It also exists in developing countries. I think just to show that this is something worldwide. So we have these studies from Ethiopia, from India, and Peru, and you all see the same trends, right? That once again, children from low socioeconomic background, have significantly lower levels of language development. And this echoes the first presentation after the fire drill, but these large inequalities, they do persist over time, right? They impact the schooling, the professional, the social-emotional trajectories of individuals. And we have many, many examples of these persisting trajectories. And in France, one of the most famous examples that comes back every 3 years is the PISA, okay, where each time it is crazy to see how we are in the ranking of PISA in terms of inequalities. That France is in the average of PISA, but is really an inequalitarian country when it comes to mathematics, learning, and stuff like that. And And just to show you this persistence, I think it is important. Once again, we go back to this Ethiopia, India, and Peru example. And we see here the relationship that exists between your level of vocabulary, so number of words that you can say at 5 years old, and the number of years of education that you reached at age 22. And you see here, it is quite obvious, the trend that exists here. And so you see again that you have those persisting problematics. Voilà. Okay, so what do we know in the environment? So why is that the case? So there are several studies, some quantitative, some qualitative, that show that low SES parents, on both the intensive and extensive margin, they tend to do less and with lower quality. So for example, at home, they have less books. And when they read to their children, it is usually with a lower level of quality. They talk less with their children, and when they talk to their children, they talk with more negative injunctions, with lower levels of vocabulary and stuff like that. And so we know that overall, what happens at home is that there is low quantity and low quality of those interactions that are really important for child development. And there are really interesting recordings, audio recordings, where you can see really the difference. It is quite obvious to see the difference that what happened in a household, in a poor household, and in a let's say rich household. So one thing that is, I think, interesting here is that for a long time we really focused on the financial barrier, right? But actually there are many activities, such as just conversing with your children, simple games that happens with, like, I don't know, like plastic bottles, with like glasses or anything like that, playing in the bath, singing some lullabies, that can have really important, really great impact on child development. And so here the point is we see one important barrier that we see is about information. And we see here that there is a really important gap in terms of information between low SES and high SES families. They have lower level of information, and so it means that they invest less on practices that are conducive to child development. And we know from some sociologic studies, for example, that there is a lot of conversations that happen within the family or within the neighborhood with low socioeconomic parents, while high socioeconomic parents tend to, I don't know, go online or read many books or formal education-related stuff. And so which explain a bit here the difference in terms of information between high SES and low SES. And so if we talk about information, at the end, I think that we have two types of policies that to help those that need more, right? So here we have the setup, so they need more information maybe to put in place better practices. And so we can think about two types of policies. We have what we call the institutional policies, right? To improve the educational quality of out-of-home environment. We can think about nurseries, schools, and we have obviously these programs in the US in the 70s that showed really huge impacts, you know, the Carolina Abecedarian, the Perry Preschool Project, and from those studies that were conducted in the 70s, the kids are now adults, but they are still followed, so every 10 years I think there is a follow-up. And so we see the difference in terms of trajectories between those two groups that were actually at first randomly randomly attributed either to a high quality education nursery or not. And so we see the difference in trajectories, and those trajectories are really different from each other. We know that children that go to nurseries, to high quality education nurseries, they have like way better lives in terms of schooling outcomes, professional outcomes, health, marital status, or whatever. It's really interesting to see that. And on the other hand, we have those what I call familial policies. So we want to try to improve the home environment of the children. And so there are, once again, here many interventions that exist that are quite famous also. I think one of the most famous, I can't remember the name right now, but these are the home visits of nurses that go to the house go to the household and talk with the parents about what needs to be done with the children in terms of health, in terms of language, or anything. We have the pediatric visits with this, for example, program in New York that is called the Video Interaction Project. So when the parents actually come to visit the pediatrics, they receive a lot of information about the good things to do at home that are conducive to child development. And here, the third one, and I want to do a focus on this, is about text messaging intervention. So more and more, I think this is a really nascent literature, at least I would say in education, that try to evaluate the effects of text messaging interventions. So text messages, so you see it here, it is really low cost. And we know from the literature that there is a potential for effective interventions to improve parental practices and child development. The interesting thing with text messages is that it is short, it is non-prescriptive information, right? And it encourages the parents to change their practices. And I think what is interesting here with text messages, it is that it is made through small steps, right? So it is not a huge change in the practices. We don't want to overburden the parents. And so each text messages adds up with small steps in order to encourage the parents to do better or to apply the good practices at home with their children. So what do we know from the literature? And I think it is quite interesting to see that there are different mechanisms that were tested to try to understand the efficacy of such intervention. So first of all, content and frequency matter. It seems obvious, but there are some studies that compared, is it better to send 1 text message a week, 3 text messages a week, or 5 a week? And so usually, what they find is that 1 text a week is way too little information, right? It doesn't change the practices enough. But 5 text messages a week is way too much, and actually it is too complex, it overburdens the parents, and actually they stop reading the text, they are really bored with it, right? So it is not efficient anymore. So we see here that from the literature that 3 text messages seem to be the most efficient to the parents to receive for a week. Timing matters too. It means that here there are some studies that show that on the weekend it seems to be way more efficient than for parents that are low educated and with children that have lower level of development. But on the contrary, for high educated parents, it seems to be better during the weekdays and especially after bedtime for the babies. So I don't know why I don't know why exactly, but it is interesting to see the mechanisms here at stake. And one really important thing, one of the most important, is about personalization. So when you send text messages that are quite generic, there is not much effect. And so it is important in the text messages to put, for example, the name of the children, to try to have to increase a sense of familiarity between the text messenger and the recipient. And I didn't see, okay. And so what is also interesting here is that, sorry, I lost my thought, but yeah, so the text messages need to be adapted to the development of the children. And so it is really important because we have some conversations with the parents with text messages, and some said, actually, you send us text messages that are not adapted at all to my children. For example, they should be able to read at that age. They were not able, and the parents felt really bad about it. And so it is really important to try to have some baseline measure of child development, and then to adapt the text messages so to fit as much as possible to the reality of the family. So all those mechanisms are quite interesting to know about. And I think one of the most important evidence comes from the US. I think it was something in Texas or California. It was the evaluation of a program named Ready for K, dedicated to low SES parents of 4 to 6 year old children. It lasted 8 months, and the idea was to send 3 text messages a week with first of all, some facts, then some tip, and finally, I forgot. Sorry. So 3 text messages a week to induce some change about some really easy practices about reading books, counting, learning with letters and stuff like that. And so this program that was really low cost, quite low intensity at the end, had really important impact. First of all, on the first stage, so on parental practices, they had really better home literacy activities. And on the second stage, it had a really important impact on child development and on their level of literacy. So we studied this study, and we tried to say, okay, what happens if we do that in France, but for younger children that are between 0 and 3 years old? Because here a lot of things happen, even more. So there is a French NGO that is specialized in the development of parenting programs, and especially they developed a text messaging intervention. So the text message intervention is quite similar to the one that I just described. It is 3 text messages a week about shared book reading, singing, games. It was with videos, with photos to show examples. The parents received some books also. And so we recruited a sample of around 400 low SES parents where their children were enrolled in nurseries. So they are quite poor parents. The program took 8 months so they received 3 text messages for 8 months. And we evaluated this with a randomized control trial setting, right? So half of them were receiving it and half did not. And we were wondering about what are the effects on parental practices, and so we used the STEAM-Q questionnaire, and what are the effects on child development, and we used mostly the website tool. And I think, first of all, what we found is really important implementation difficulties. We see here that at first the parents, they seem to be attracted by it, but then there is a big drop in the reading of the text messages. Because in the text messages, we had some links where the parents could go to see videos and photos, but actually at some point, while all of them were clicking, after a few weeks, I don't know, maybe half of them just stopped doing the thing. So there is something here that we cannot really understand on how really to fit with the parents, how for them to take up these kind of interventions. But still, on the bright side, we found, I think, some quite moderate size effects on parental practices. They read way better to their children. And this was especially the case for low acuity parents, poor parents, and parents with younger children. So it seems that actually we kind of started the reading a bit earlier than before, which is interesting. And so the effect was between 20% of the standard deviation to 30% of the standard deviation, which is quite high for such low cost and low intensity intervention. But however, we did not find any effect on child development, which was quite frustrating. And so, well, either it is not enough, it is possible, right? It is not that high intensity, but it is also possible with that we don't have enough power, right? The sample size is quite small, and maybe there are some effect on the children, but maybe not as high as we expected when we first designed the experiment. But so, in any case, I think it gave, overall, we see that there is, from the literature, from this study here in France, we see that there is a potential for really low-cost and efficient interventions that are directed to parents in order to improve child development and overall, at the meta level, to reduce inequalities overall. But of course, it calls for really a good adapted implementation to try to adapt to all the parents, to try to understand what happens to the parents, why do they drop out, why do they like it, and there is a need really for future evaluations. Right now in France, we have a big evaluation where we send text messages to the parents to nudge them about going to nurseries, for example, to ask to go to nurseries. We are conducting a second evaluation of this program at higher scales with poorer parents. And so there are many things to be done, I think, in terms of text messaging and how to try to nudge parents and reduce inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Quentin, for showing us more perhaps what we can do to tackle these inequalities we've been discussing today. Are there any questions from the public? Start here and then. Oh, no.
Thank you. Two comments that you may or may not have already thought about. There's quite a bit of work showing that most people think intelligence is not changeable, that you're born with it, you're stuck. And people who are lower income believe that more than people who are higher income. So one of the things that you might think about is the beliefs that the parents have about intelligence and intellectual development. The second thing is, another thing that we know about interventions that really matters is feedback. And I'm wondering if you've ever thought about adding a condition where you would show the parents the improvement in the cognitive development while it's happening, even though it's not as much as you hope for. I suspect that would increase the power of your intervention.
Yeah, okay, well, really good points about the growth mindset and stuff like that. So I think this is important to try to tackle that. We haven't on this text intervention. And on the second point, the new version of it is like to have psychologists and orthophonists that do like a feedback session every 3 months, and that sits with the family, either on the house or by phone, just to say, okay, what happened, what do you think, what is complicated, and stuff like that, to try to have some feedback and to see, oh, look, actually, your child is doing he has a lot of improvements, or continue like that. And I think it will have more power, that's for sure.
Thank you so much. I think this is such a challenging area, but so important. And I want to geek out for a minute on some of the technology stuff. So, and it's really interesting what Gary talked about, which is around beliefs and feedback. There's a researcher called Dana Susskind who works in Chicago. I don't know if you were challenging her, Gary, or just happens to be a coincidence. She's actually a paediatric ear surgeon, but has spent a lot of time looking at parental beliefs, and that actually parental beliefs around a whole range of things are set very early, and that you actually don't disrupt those beliefs, they just keep going. So you actually have to have interventions that disrupt people's beliefs in, I guess, their ability to change things. But the other thing she's developing, which is kind of cool, is working with Google to try and create a kind of language feedback tool. So you know, those of you who work in language development will know about the Lena, which was a kind of thing you shoved in kids, but it was kind of cumbersome and large. This would be a really cheap thing. And one of the things that it would do then would be provide feedback either to the parent or potentially to the childcare provider, which I know we're talking about the home learning environment here, but actually we've got to have mutually reinforcing environments that would actually say what this child's language was like, and then the sorts of things that you could do to reinforce. Because to your point, in low-income families, but it's not actually income, it's low-educated families, it's education that's the key. The language isn't so, but if you had something that was feeding back to you to say, hey, here are the sorts of things you can talk about, and this similarly with the childcare provider in an actual real-time provision, I think these are the sorts of things we should start thinking about. These kind of, like, I think text messages is fine, but you're always going to get kind of weird take-up of who's going to take those up and who looks at their data and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I think that we should think quite creatively about the combination of things we can do. So you've got Reach Out and Read that gives people free books. You've got text messaging, and then could we actually provide this kind of language feedback and embedded in vehicles such as home visiting, because home visiting itself is just a vehicle for doing great interventions. So I just put that out there in terms of us thinking quite creatively about the sorts of things that are going to be needed to actually shift the dial, because we did nurse home visiting trial, and by the time the children were 3, they're already 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. And we nudge things a bit, but, you can't catch up. So by 3, it's kind of done.
Okay, but this is a really interesting comment. I agree with you. And I think that we are trying to do one thing. So it could be interesting to talk about it, but we are trying to do one thing in the south of France, is to develop an application to the parents where you have kind of a numeric virtual carnet de santé, health book that you actually give to your doctor, to your pediatric, and each time that you go to do a visit, the pediatrics are usually in France a lot of time. From what I heard, I'm not a doctor, but they don't spend a lot of time on language development, and so we are trying to also nudge the family and the doctor, so to have some feedbacks, regular feedbacks about child development of the children, and so yeah, but that's really good point. Yeah.
Okay, I forgot to say who I was. I'm Anders Jan, pediatrician from Stockholm. I was just wondering, the main issues that we have actually in Sweden at the moment, and I don't know if we're kind of in the forefront here, or if the rest of you have similar thoughts, is that the big problem at the moment when it comes to speech development is the competition that reading and talking has from screens. What we see a lot in clinical practice is, for example, that children who present with a speech delay, a language delay, start speaking English instead of Swedish. Because we're a small country, so we don't have so much software in our own language. So these children learn from the software. And so, I mean, it can, and the screen time can be seen as a problem, but probably also has a real potential to improve language development. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that and how you're handling that here in France.
Oh wow, that's a tough question. No, I think it's interesting, and I think, yeah, I saw the news about Sweden and the experimentation, the generalization of the screen, and I don't really know how to answer that, but I know that would be super nice to evaluate it at a large scale to see how things are. I know that there are so many, programs with like Sesame Street that helps a lot the kids, especially I know that in refugee camps, there are a lot of kids that learn through tablet programs with Sesame Street, which is really amazing because they don't have much parental education. So it seems that it can be really efficient in some places, maybe not in others. Yeah.
Yeah, John Lynch from Australia. 2 questions. You said that no detectable effect. Did you mean 0 effect, or were you talking about some assessment based on statistical criteria like a confidence interval? So that's the first one. Second one is, the field that we work in is characterised by underpowered RCTs. It is the norm. How do we bridge the world of academic RCTs that you have low SES parents, but they're volunteers, they've consented to be in this trial? And you mentioned something that was important in the texting, which is personalisation. And I thought, well, how am I going to know the names of all the poor kids out there? Where do we get that from when we move this into the real world? So do you have any thoughts on that?
The first one, I think the point estimate was around like 8% of the standard deviation, and so it was not significant. So we don't know if it's a pure 0 or not, but we didn't have any enough power. And the second, I think that it is a really important question in terms of it brings the gap between the experiment and the public policy. I think, for example, in France, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, the CAF, which is the, I don't know how to translate that, the administrative web benefit for families and stuff like that, they have, like a exhaustive data set of the parents. And we know that this NGO actually goes from the CAF to actually contact the parents, and through that we can have the names. It requires, I think, a lot of things in terms of GDPR, but I think in terms of public policy with administrative data sets, you could, I think, at least personalize with the names, though true that personalizing in terms of child development seems to be completely too complicated. But yeah, it is a really important discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you again for your intervention.
Thank you very much.